the plans for the new Graduate Arts campus are very well underway, and is it better? Okay. And we had an incredible staff meeting where a lot of the new people who are being brought in to help us with this bigger endeavor were there, and it's got a lot of energy to it, and we're really excited about it. We have a couple people in the audience who will be teaching with us in the fall. Bob Ganay is going to be teaching a course on style in Southampton. And Andrew Botsford, who is coming and who should be here any minute, has been brought on to help Luann as associate editor of the Southampton Review, so they'll both be here later tonight. The working title of the new school is Graduate School of the Arts Southampton. I think the working title part of that is it's going to become Working Graduate School of the Arts Manhattan. That would just kind of a little theme in my life. Our terrific summer conference workshops are really filling up. We have, I think, 3 that only have 1 space left, so if you're intending to take a workshop this summer, please do so. Please enroll immediately. We're thrilled to have Meg Wolitzer reading with us tonight. She will be teaching a course this summer. She won't be teaching with us in the fall because she's going to Florence with Christian and the winter intercession. So we're excited for Meg to continue on with us and wish her the best in Italy. I've so heavily courted Dan Menaker that the staff calls me the dog run stalker. Dan and I have dogs and we frequent the same dog run, and I've talked to him about working with us for many a play date. And we're really thrilled. He'll be teaching humor writing with us in the fall in the city here, and we hope he'll come with us to the Turkana Basin in Kenya for the winter intercession. There's Andrew Botsford, who I mentioned earlier, who's being brought on as the associate editor. So. The last piece of news is also this summer, for the first time, we're offering a film production course that's going to span the length of the 2 summer sessions. So it's very exciting. It's the beginning of the film production wing that we're going to have under the Graduate Arts campus. Pretty exciting. Finally, I'd like to introduce Suzanna Filip. She's going to introduce Dan Menaker, who's going to read first tonight. Suzanna is a student that has particular meaning to me in addition to running Skype in our classes and video now and doing everything else you could imagine. She's my first thesis student, and her memoir, The Other Me, is fantastic, and it's about her search to recover from being held at gunpoint by a couple of professional hitmen while the rest of her life fell apart. It's a beautiful story full of courage, and it's very original, and I'm proud to have worked with her on it. So please welcome Suzanna.
It was a hot, muggy lunch at the Southampton Writers' Conference. My legs stuck to the plastic chair, and I could barely hear my voice over the cicadas croaking in the trees. The table I was sitting at had just been taken over by VIPs, people who make my mouth dry and my mind suddenly unable to concentrate on anything other than the ant crawling toward the umbrella hole in the middle of the table. After a year and a half as an MFA student, I'd finally been able to convince myself that 2 of these VIPs, Melissa Bank and Matthew Clam, were approachable enough that I could have a conversation with them, mostly with me asking them questions about writing. The 3rd VIP, Daniel Menaker, I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't recognize from his 26-year tenure at The New Yorker, where he reached the rank of senior editor specializing in fiction. He was the first to publish the stories of David Foster Wallace, Michael Chabon, Susan Minot, Michael Cunningham, Anne Packard, our own Matthew Clam, and recent Pulitzer Prize winner Jennifer Egan, among others. I didn't recognize this VIP because he became senior literary editor and vice president at Random House in 1995. He went on to HarperCollins as executive editor-in-chief, then returned to Random House as senior vice president and executive editor-in-chief, a title he says he asked for after having literally dreamed it. In these roles, he acquired or edited, among many other great works, the best-selling sensation Primary Colors by Anonymous, who later everyone knew as Joe Klein, Elizabeth Strout's Pulitzer Prize winner Olive Kitteridge, National Book Award winner Let the Great World Spin by Colin McCann, and National Book Critics Circle Award winner and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, New Jack, Guardian Sing Sing by Ted Conifer. I also didn't recognize this VIP at my table as having twice won an O. Henry Prize, or as the author of 2 books of short stories, Friends and Relations and The Old Left. I didn't recognize him for his humor book, The Worst, or his novel, The Treatment, which was subsequently made into a movie. No, in my initial moment of stunned disorientation, I didn't recognize Dan Menaker for the amazing accomplishments that make him one of the great literary luminaries of our time. Instead, clips of him hosting 6 episodes of Title Page TV flashed through my mind. With his endearingly lopsided smile and his rhythmic, comma way of speaking, his instinctive literary curiosity jumped through my computer screen and convinced me that authors were capable of examining the hard truths of our lives with artistry and care. See, I came across Dan at a time when I spent as much time Googling authors, reading their words, and dreaming of one day being interviewed in a similar fashion, as I did actually sitting at my desk writing. And now, here he was at my table at the Southampton Writers' Conference, talking about the differences of form in autobiography, personal essay, and memoir, and all I could think was that I should reach out and brush the ant onto the ground before someone squashed it. Then, Magdalene Brandeis eloquently leaned over and said that in about 10 minutes, I was to conduct an impromptu interview with the author who had just published a book called A Good Talk on the Art of Conversation for the conference's YouTube channel. I mean, there are no expectations there, right? Because what did I have to talk to him about without any prep time? The only thing I knew from reading his essays or watching episode 6 of Title Page, called National Obsession, was that Dan and I shared a nostalgia for Americana and a fondness for country music. But both pairs of my lucky cowboy boots were 100 miles away in my apartment in New York City. I essentially had no way in. And at least tonight, I've had a little bit of lead time. So Dan, I came prepared. I wore my Lucchese's. We're extremely lucky to have Dan Menaker with us this evening to read from his new memoir in progress, My Mistake. This VIP, who has shepherded and molded some of the great works of promising fiction writers and is himself a published author, obviously brings a unique perspective to the craft of writing. I'd like to quote one of the many insightful things he shared last summer. He says, "I've learned from watching writers that there is such a thing as a voice. It is essential, central, and indispensable. A literary voice is unique, and it is paramount to the achievement of the high cultural goal that literary writers set for themselves. Good writers listen to their voice. I found mine in a heap, all mixed up, and I continue to try to untangle it." Reading tonight in his own untangled voice from My Mistake, it is with great respect and admiration that I introduce Daniel Menaker.
I used to, in high school in Nyack, New York, drink a lot of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer and drive home about 10 blocks to see how long I could keep my eyes closed while driving. And at that time, I never even imagined I'd ever have an introduction like that. Partly because I wasn't sure if I'd get home, and partly because it would have been a dream to be so praised. And the other reason is that I don't drive with my eyes closed anymore because I have 2 children of my own. But I still don't recognize that person. But I thank you, Suzanna, very, very much. You have to know, I'm going to read briefly, I hope, 15 or 20 minutes. You have to know a couple of things before I read. I had to kind of do some Euclidean premises. From them, the rest of it sort of comes. Also, my proposal, which consists of about 25,000 words out of what I think will be about 75,000, so it's not insignificant, has been out with 15 publishers for about 2 weeks, and I've gotten about 7 no's. And the title, my mistake, is seeming apter and apter. If aptness admits of degree, I'm not sure whether anything can be apter, but it's very apt. And I hope it doesn't get any apter. It's an odd memoir. I mean, I can see if I were in publishing and under present publishing circumstances, it would be an odd duck, and it might not quack for anybody. Here's what you have to know. Wallace Shawn, the son of William Shawn, who was the editor of the New Yorker, went to Harvard and graduated, I think, in the class of '64. 3 or 4 of his classmates were hired on as writers at the New Yorker. Jonathan Schell, Hendrik Hertzberg, Anthony Hiss, and I forget, but somebody else. That's one thing. The second thing you have to know is that there was an office called collating where there were 2 people, Ed Stringham and Mary Alice Rogers, who sat and took proofs in from everybody and made master proofs of all the changes that the editor and the author had accepted. And it went up for revision or for going to press from that master proof. Ed Stringham was a friend of the Beat Poets and liked to sit in his big armchair, and one day he fell asleep and the cigarette went into the easy chair and lit the whole thing on fire internally, and it started smoldering. And luckily there was a firehouse next door to the New Yorker, and the firemen came up and took this totally smoking chair downstairs in an elevator and extinguished it on the sidewalk with hoses. That's another thing you have to know. The third thing that you have to know is that William Shawn was a very strange man and a kind of Maoist figure who sort of technically said everything that happened that he did and all the very powerful decisions he made had nothing to do with his own vanity or his own power or his own authority. It was all for the magazine. And once there was a transit strike in New York, and I hitchhiked around town, and I wrote a talk in the town story about it. And at the end of the story, as happened at the end of my research, I was standing in Times Square, and I asked some random person, "How are you getting around town?" And he said, "Diesel." And I said, what do you mean? And he pointed to his feet and said, "Diesel get me anywhere." So I put that in the story, and Talk of the Town at that time, I don't know about now, since it was set up on a Tuesday night, and I had to go to press on Friday, came out in page proof, not in galleys, just like all made up, ready to go, and then the editing process took place. And lo and behold, the line had been cut. There were no diesels anywhere in sight. So I put it back in writing even tinier than Mr. Shawn's, and gave it to the talk editor, Mr. Weeks. I got a phone call a few, maybe half an hour later, and Mr. Menaker? I said, "Yes." "This is Mr. Shawn. Could you come into my office for a moment, please?" Like that's how he spoke. I said, "Sure." So I came to his office. He said, "Please sit down." Tom Wolfe pointed out that in a scathing piece that Shawn was a very short man, and he had a couch that you sort of sank down in, so that no matter how tall you were shorter than Mr. Shawn. He said, "I understand that you'd like to put that pun back in at the end of this story." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I don't expect you to know this kind of thing." It's all right, I'm not judging you. There's no way that you could quite grasp what I'm about to say unless I tell you it, and really I mean no criticism of you. But if we were to restore that pun, it would destroy the New Yorker. Okay, now you know what you have to know. So here's this short section about working with Pauline Kael, who was the movie critic for a long time for the New Yorker, and it brings in other people. Basically, there were editors and writers, and then there was everyone else. Most of us who hadn't settled into the equivalent of Ed Stringham's smoldering chair wanted to be one or both of the former. There wasn't much room, especially with Wallace Shawn's classmates jostling each other in the halls as staff writers. And with the editors, once they landed in those coveted positions, almost never leaving. And oh, I forgot one thing. Oh, I forgot one thing. I was asked to leave. After about 2.5 years, I was asked to leave. I was told to take my time, that I should look for another job. Sorry. Okay. Editors almost never leaving, and the other aging Flying Dutchman types who grayly haunted the corridors hoping that a piece they'd written about Indonesian metallurgy 2 years earlier might yet see the light of publication. In my first 15 or 20 years there, 3 fiction editors were forced out by mandatory retirement, including the person who saved my professional life, William Maxwell, and maybe 2 or 3 others left. Why would you leave? Where would you go? When I was still in bad trouble, that's the being told to leave part, I asked to see Mr. Shawn at some point to try to somehow regain his good graces. And he said to me quietly, Mr. Menaker, you could go anywhere else and be a star. I could almost see the disdain dripping from that last word. No, someone should buy this book, I'm telling you. Anyway. Another time, with me still allegedly on my way out the door, and really and truly trying to find another job, and in one case taking one, only to have the magazine that hired me fold before I could leave. When I asked about the possibility of writing a piece about Swarthmore College, where I went to school, he said, well, I really don't mean to criticize you. I don't expect people, even the people who work here, to understand these matters and these distinctions. Yes, that crap again, I said to myself. But what you want to write is an article. And the New Yorker doesn't publish articles. No diminutive had ever sounded smaller. If you think about articles, it actually is a diminutive, by the way. There was a whole list of words he hated, like article, many of which someone fashioned into the following sentence. Locating his gadget at the urinal, Tom Wolfe saw a photo of the intriguing, balding tycoon. Tom Wolfe, because Tom Wolfe had written a scathing portrait of Shawn in the Culture of the New Yorker in New York Magazine, which was at the time still part of the Sunday Herald Tribune. So, this amber-like permanence of people not leaving gave one decades of observation of the same people and oneself. And I'm just going to read a little bit about Pauline Kael, who was a fascinating character. She was a very famous movie critic, and when I edited her work later on, I was told to take my time leaving and finding a job. I didn't have to get out, so it took me 26 years to leave. When I edited her work, I'd have to go down the stairs from the 20th floor to the 18th floor and take her a proof with my suggestions on it. A fan was on in her office, almost always, even in the dead of winter, and it blew directly on her and me as we went over her column. I learned a huge amount about voice from her. At the beginning of our work together, she would see my changes, often having to do with some kind of illogic, because she spilled out her prose in a headlong and heedless way. And she'd read my changes aloud and say, with very uncharacteristic politesse, "That's elegant, Dan, but it doesn't sound like me, really." Then she'd take the essence of the suggestion and render it into her own pell-mell Paulinese. I learned after a while to make my suggestions in language closer to her own, and it helped me realize that I had a voice, this here voice, for whatever it's worth, that I had a voice too, and that every writer has one, and the more distinctive and natural, two qualities that are in quite a bit of tension, the more distinctive and natural it is, the better it's going to be. And she was, for the most part, very, very good. She once found some kind of blemish on my skin. She took out makeup and said, "Here, just let me." Ah, that's much better. She also enjoyed her side of the war between herself and William Shawn. She would bedevil him with risque language and descriptions for the sole sake, I came to realize, of making gleeful fun of him when his proof arrived and we went over it. And she also furnished me with a running commentary on the magazine's other writing. "What do you think of notes and comment this week, Dan?" she might ask. I thought it was, "It's soft," she said. "It's really soft. The whole magazine is soft this week. I hope it gets hard again really soon." Going to screenings with her was embarrassing. They are usually held in small screening rooms and everyone's behavior is on display to everyone else. And usually professional silence and efficiency prevail. You go to the screening, you nod at a few people you know, you sit, you watch, you leave. But if Pauline found a movie or any part of a movie absurd, as she did once with all of Lucio Visconti's Ludwig, about the degenerate life of Ludwig of Bavaria, with me in tow, she would chortle throughout and exclaim, "Oh no! Oh, that's just awful! I can't believe this! This is ridiculous!" I have to say, that subject did ask for ridiculousness. From a biography of Ludwig, the litany of bizarre behavior included his pathological shyness, his avoidance of state business, his complex and expensive flights of fancy, including moonlit picnics at which his young groomsmen were said to be ordered to strip naked and dance. Pauline once told me that if she disagreed with someone about a movie more than about 3 times a year, she could not be their friend. Most peculiarly of all, when my wife's and my second child arrived, our daughter, Lizzie, L-I-Z-I, her spelling, believe me, and I told Pauline about it, she was very upset. She was actually affronted. She looked at me angrily and she said, "Now why would you do that?" It may have had something to do with the fact that I'd probably had less time to be available in the office and to her. My impatience with her reading her whole column out loud to me 3 or 4 times after I learned the initial valuable lesson that that was a very effective way for anyone to hear his or her own writing voice may have shown through my phony attentiveness. Now I had yet another person to give my attention to. So one day, after I had worked with Pauline for a few years, Mr. Shawn suddenly appeared in my office and asked, "May I sit down?" Oh, honestly, I thought, what am I going to say? And then he said, "Now, don't be upset, Mr. Menaker. I want to assure you that this is in no way a reflection on your work. You've done good work with her and lasted longer than 3 or 4 other editors have lasted with her." At this point, since it was out of the blue, I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. He went on, "You lasted longer with her than Mr. Botsford did. You lasted longer with her than someone else did, and you even lasted longer with her than I did." A small, reassuring, and totally unconvincing chuckle. And I still didn't know what he was talking about. And then he said, "But Miss Kale feels you may not have the time to work closely enough with her as her editor and would like to work with someone else." This news was very upsetting at first. As Gina Centrello, my boss at Random House, once said to me, no matter how it's done, and no matter how confident you are, no one feels good about being fired, ever. But at that point at the New Yorker, I had finally found some equilibrium, had crawled away from the cliff's edge through a tangle of briars and out into a clearing with some solid ground to stand on and some confidence. And about half an hour after Sean left my office and I was done stewing about my failure, I felt a great weight lifting off me. No more stairs from 20 to 18 to 20, no more icy fan air, no more unwanted makeup, no more whole column recitatives, no more embarrassing screenings, no more crossfire between Pauline Kael and Mr. Sean. It was a real liberation, it turned out, and a good lesson about looking at failure from a different angle. Pauline had a house in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, near our house, where I am yet again. This is about the writing of the piece, this time looking at our dog, Maxwell, in 30-degree weather under zinc-colored skies. The spring will not come this year, and sleeping in the driveway. Oh, to be a Tibetan, as he is. To say nothing of a terrier, and a cosseted one at that. He had been digging a hole in the lawn for 15 minutes, as industriously as a gravedigger, pausing to consider his work every minute or two, and sometimes going to the other side of the excavation and attacking the earth from his own and more primal version of a different angle. It occurs to me that he's doing something like what a memoir writer does, looking at things from a different angle. So anyway, William Whitworth, a wonderful writer and editor, and one of Sean's never going to happen potential successors, inherited Pauline Kael, lasted longer than I did, even longer than I did, and developed a stomach ulcer, and ultimately left to become the editor of The Atlantic. Miss Kael and I became friends up here years before she died. She had noticed something I'd written about Emmylou Harris and gave me a nice compliment about it. I told her that once I'd been interviewing Emmylou Harris years earlier at Carnegie Hall after a concert when we were both in our early 30s. She was in what seemed to be like a friendly rivalry with Linda Ronstadt at the time. I was in love with Emmylou Harris, which distinguished me from maybe 4 blind, deaf men in America. She turned away to say something to someone else, turned back to me, and said, "I'm sorry, Dave, what was the question?" I said, "It's Dan, but that's okay, Linda." She laughed. 10 minutes later, after circulating in the room in what's called a meet and greet, she came back to me and said, "We're going out to have some dinner. Would you like to come?" I said that I couldn't, even though I absolutely could, because I was so terrified. Oh, my mistake. Pauline listened. When I was finished, she said, "You asshole." I laughed and I said, "Thanks, Pauline. Thanks for your understanding after I told you this mortifying, youthful tale of terror." She said, "You have to understand, I say that because when I was in San Francisco at KPFA, Duke Ellington propositioned me. I was a young, swooning girl, but I said no, too." I said, "Well, in my case, I'm not sure proposition is the right," and she interrupted and said, "Asshole is." As I've said, she was always trying to provoke Sean with her rowdy language. So since he had asked me to let him know if there might be anything he could find offensive in the copy, I sometimes had to call him at home in the evening when Pauline handed her copy in late. If he had objections, he would tell me to substitute TK for the offending passage, and he and Pauline would duke it out the next day. So one night I decided that I should call him about her description of a scene in which a man butted his head into a woman's crotch. "I don't like it," he said. "Let me think." "Vagina wouldn't work," he said. And then he added helpfully, "because that's the opening." actually, he was not the first to know about this passage. Because when I first called, Mrs. Shawn answered. I said, Mrs. Shawn, this is Dan Menaker calling from the New Yorker. Oh yes, Mr. Menaker, how are you? I'm fine, thank you, and you? I'm fine, how can I help you? Well, I'm editing Miss Kale's current cinema column, and there's something in it that I think Mr. Shawn might not like, and he asked me to call him under such circumstances. It's sort of marginal, but I thought I should check. Oh, I'm sure you're right. Mr. Shawn would want to know. He should be home very soon, but in the meantime, why don't you tell me what the trouble is? And I'll tell him the minute he walks in the door. It's a little embarrassing, I said. Maybe I should just talk to Mr. Shawn. You're married now, aren't you, Mr. Menaker? Yes. Well, then I think it's perfectly all right for you to tell me. Thank you. That's all I
We're so lucky to have him teaching with us. So is Maxwell named after William Maxwell then, not Maxwell Perkins?
He's named after William.
Oh, cool.
Much greater.
To introduce our fabulous Meg Wolitzer, who we adore completely, we have our student Ricki Miller, who has charmed us all with her essays in the Intro to Graduate Writing. A school teacher for 35 years, she's sure to have charmed her children too. She's now on her way to becoming a fiction writer, maybe. So please help me welcome Ricki Miller.
First of all, I'd like to thank Dan for making the worst principal I ever worked for 10 years who tortured me not look so bad. I mean, in retrospect, I got mugs, I got little toys on my desk with bobbing heads, 3 pencils, wasn't so bad. Meg Wolitzer always knew she wanted to be a writer. When she went to first grade in Syosset, Long Island, she walked up to her teacher's desk and asked Mrs. Gerby if she would write her stories as she dictated them, since she had the creativity to make them up, but lacked the skill to actually write them down. So there was little Margaret, as she was called in those days, standing on tiptoe, going on and on about a boy and his father who became astronauts and fly to Mars. After a while, Meg finally paused, and her teacher wrote a period, thinking she was done, but she wasn't. Instead, she heard Meg utter those 2 dreaded words, the anchor of run-on sentences everywhere, and then. Now this went on for a long time, and an interesting backstory occurred that Meg was totally unaware of. As engrossed as she was in Meg's story, while scribing her work, Mrs. Gerby noticed that the bulletin board backing was faded and needed to be replaced. The 2 boys in the corner of the room were tussling around and killing each other, and she desperately needed to go to the bathroom. But she didn't say any of this out loud. In fact, she never once contemplated saying to cute little Meg, "Finish the goddamn story already." What she said instead was the kind of thing that encouraging teachers say all the time. "Wonderful, Meg, keep on going." And for all these years, she has. Meg wrote her first published book while still in college. Her latest, The Uncoupling, is her 9th novel. 2 of Meg's books, This Is Your Life and Surrender Dorothy, have been made into films. She won a National Endowment for the Arts grant in literature, and her work has been in Best American Short Stories and the Pushcart Prize. Her children's book, The Fingertips of Duncan Dorfman, will be published in September. In The Uncoupling, Dorothy Lang, a happily married 40-something-year-old English teacher at Eleanor Roosevelt High School in Stellar Plains, New Jersey, discovers something unsettling and mysterious has happened. A spell has been cast. She's no longer interested in sex, not even a little. And neither are any of the other women of all ages, shapes, and sizes who teach with her. Even the female teenage students are done with sex, and some of them haven't even started. This is a book about women who no longer want sex and the men they no longer want sex with. So what happens next? Meg's characters are so real, her sense of humor so sharp, her writing so pitch perfect, I believe the British would say spot on, and her story so entrancing that I couldn't put the book down. No wonder it has gotten rave reviews. I told Meg that there were 2 parts of the book that I actually fell off the couch. I was laughing so hard. So she said to me, "Did you hurt yourself?" Please join me in welcoming the author of The 10-Year Nap and the wife, Mrs. Gerby's most prolific and talented student, our very own Meg Wolitzer.
Thank you, that was great. So I have read from this book a few times out in the summer, I realized, and I thought, uh-oh, there's an overlap of audience, so I gotta read something that I haven't read from it before. So I sort of ran out of funny parts, so this is not such a funny part. But as Ricki said, a spell has been cast over Eleanor Roosevelt High School in Stellar Plains, New Jersey, during the rehearsals for a production of Lysistrata, which we all know as the sex strike play by Aristophanes. And in this section, actually, which I've never read before and may never read again, I don't know, we'll see, you decide, which is a little bit of a more serious section, it involves one of the teenagers whose name is Marissa Claiborne, and she is an African-American young woman, girl, who is playing Lysistrata in the play. And the spell, which kind of comes over all the women and teenage girls in a kind of cold wind, going through their bedrooms. I should say that none of the women in the book knows that she's under the spell, but the reader does. She just knows that she has turned away, doesn't want to do this anymore. In this section, there's a reference to a baby who was born to 2 high school students a couple of years earlier, whose name is Trivet, and they named him that, kind of getting confused, thinking they were saying Travis or Trevor. So he appears. Also, there's a reference to a virtual reality world that all the teenagers are really involved in called Forest, and it's spelled F-A-R-R-E-S-T. And they're all on it, and they have avatars. And Marissa Claiborne is a hawk, so we'll get into that. And finally, where this section leaves off, I'll just tell you something that happens after it, is that she, who is supposed to play Lysistrata, there's a mention of her bed, and she brings her bed into the parking lot of the school and is going to have a kind of bed-in regarding until the war in Afghanistan ends. So that happens, that's a kind of what happens after this ends. So this is Marissa's section. But the spell, though it had been so proficient, was nowhere near being finished. Under the arch of her canopy bed, Marissa Claiborne was overcome by it too. Had she known this was happening, she would have been shocked, for she was not the kind of person to be frequently overcome by anything. Common colds had rarely felled her. Sad movies tended to leave her tearless. Yet when the spell came for her, she was as susceptible as the rest of them. Marissa had been working all year at Froze, the dessert place in the mall, which she sometimes called cottage cheese for suckers. The product did have a curd-like, highly textured quality. It wasn't cottage cheese, but it wasn't officially yogurt either, or ice cream. No one knew what it was. But 3 evenings a week, Marissa sold it to customers, almost all women. Customers who admitted that the one thing they looked forward to in the evening was a cup of Froze that they could put a lid on and take home to their house, or just eat right in the store, blunting the pointed peak with a grateful tongue. So many women who came to the store in the mall lately said they craved Froze. That was the word they used. Marissa Claiborne was one of those girls who was not interested in sweet desserts or food of any kind, really. She'd never had an eating disorder, but had been thin and rangy. She'd been given the female lead in the school play virtually every year. There were 20 black kids in the grade at Elrow, and she was friends with a few, though almost none of them had been in middle school with her, when her most intense friendships had begun. She was good friends with a black girl named Jade Stills, who was a drummer. African drumming? Carrie's mother had asked with interest when they went over to the Petito's. No, just regular, Mom, Carrie had hurried to say, mortified. Marissa's friends from middle school had remained her real crowd. They were the ones she truly knew, even if, she thought, they did not know her that well anymore. During 9th grade, Marissa had had sex with one boy and then, over the summer before 10th, with another. She didn't feel strongly about either of them at the time, but when they'd showed an interest in her, she'd been curious to see what would happen. Quite a few other girls at Elro were sexually experienced. There was Chloe Vincent, who'd been sleeping with Max Holleran since last year, the two of them in love. And then there was sad sack Becca Nilsson, who drank insanely and slept with anything. There was talented Eve Scarpin, who'd apparently had enjoyable hookups with a couple of different senior boys and a man in his 20s. Lara Lonigan, another non-virgin, was an interesting emo girl who submitted short stories to the literary magazine The New Deal about a moody young girl involved with an older guy. In a high school like Elro, people knew things about you, and by now a certain number of people had heard that Marissa had slept with 2 boys. It had become common and acceptable in recent years to go far with a guy or with different ones. If someone called you a slut, it was probably one of your friends saying it as a joke, and you could reply, "Thank you." But as the first girl in her group of friends to have hooked up in any capacity, and then as the first one to actually lose her virginity, she'd been expected to report back to the others in detail. Willa Lang had been particularly interested in hearing a step-by-step account, and she'd asked a series of exhausting questions. What was it like? Did it hurt? Did you like it? How would you rate it on a scale of 1 to 10? She didn't know how to reply, for she didn't like the idea of disappointing them the way she had been disappointed. Ralph Devereaux, age 17, the son of her parents' good friends, was a senior in Deer Heights, his skin light brown and touched with old, faint acne scars. He and Marissa had known each other since they were small, and their families had gotten together for warm weather backyard parties. Her mother would light citronella candles, and the Claibornes and the Devereaux would sit at a picnic table until it grew late. For a long time, Ralph had seemed mildly annoying, teasing her about how thin she was, but once he hit 15, she noticed that he'd begun to lift weights, and his previously soft arms were different. He teased her less, and when he arrived in the backyard with his family, he hung back, sitting on the redwood glider by himself. Then when he was 17, he returned to the house without his family, just for the purpose of seeing her, which pleased her, not because she particularly liked him, but because the way they might be with each other was potentially private, unrelated to anyone in either family. Their first evening together was unremarkable, filled with talk that went nowhere. "So what's your situation?" he asked as he drove her home from a diner. He'd eaten a fish fillet sandwich, onion rings, and a large square piece of 7-layer cake. She'd had a Sprite. "What do you mean? In school?" "I'm in honors classes." "I mean, are you in a relationship?" She almost laughed. She was 15. Relationships were what you heard about from other people. But as soon as Ralph said it, she didn't want to tell him anything about herself. "I might be," she said. He was going off to Rutgers to study business in the fall, and the third time he took Marissa out, he turned to her in the car and said, "I'm going to be working my balls off at my uncle's paint store this summer, then I'm leaving for college in the fall, so if you want anything from me, you better get it now. Kitchen's closing." "I don't want anything from you." "Okay, whatever, just letting you know." And then he put an arm around her. She didn't move away, but sat under the weight of it, trying to decide what she thought. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't much of anything either. She would let him keep it there. Ralph looked at her, raising his eyebrows. They parked by a defunct overpass. Raising his eyebrows was meant to be a question of some sort. She raised hers back, and she supposed was her answer. He said, "You're cute," and he put a finger on the tip of her nose. She didn't move. Then he said, "Now we're on the same page here, right?" And she said yes. "Okay," Ralph said. Then he nodded gravely and cast his eyes downward toward his fly, which he unzipped with a single loud syllable, revealing an anatomical part that was pretty much as she'd expected, since she and her friends had been studying them online since 7th grade. Marissa was shocked by his action, but abstractly interested. He motioned to her, and for some reason she slid toward him. They sat unmoving, and then he nodded again encouragingly and dipped his head in suggestion. She understood, and she followed, tentatively ducking down low and putting her mouth on his penis. But as soon as she did this, he put his hands on the back of her head and steered her as if she were a video game console. Within moments, he was moving fast and repeating a word that sounded like geez or sheesh or cheese, and she understood what this was about. She picked up the nuances of this episode quickly, the same way she'd always memorized lines from a play or French verbs to conjugate. After he cried an awful strangled cry, "Gah!" he recovered quickly, zipped his pants and said, "Who would have thought?" And then he touched her nose again and drove her home. "I guess the kitchen hasn't officially closed yet," he said. "Shut up, Ralph." "Okay," he said cheerfully. That night she told a few friends and they were quietly awed. "It just happened?" Willa said. "I mean, how did you know what he meant when he said, 'You're on the same page'?" She couldn't explain. "I just knew," she said cryptically. But Willa had other questions. Did Marissa feel very different? Marissa realized the answer was no, which she supposed was good, because not feeling different allowed you to view sex as a normal part of life, as a reasonable activity that you could engage in with another person whenever you were both in the mood. She got together with Ralph on 2 more evenings, and then he thought it was time to take it to the next step. When it happened, she regarded the experience of going the distance with Ralph Devereaux from somewhere high above, like a hawk circling a car. She couldn't decide what she thought about it, beyond the fact that it hurt too much at first for something that was supposed to be natural. With their pants at their ankles and a condom safely snapped onto him, she felt it was a point of pride not to express pain here. He didn't know whether or not she was a virgin. She didn't want him ever to know. That was her business. It was entirely possible. He had never done this before either. Willa, of course, begged to know everything again, which not only included the technical parts, but also the feelings, the sensations. Willa wanted a subjective description of sex and a catalog. She wanted something poetic. Marissa couldn't imagine what she was meant to say, but finally she just said, "That's kind of private." In the summer, Ralph Devereaux started his job at his uncle's paint store and had no time to come over again, which was fine. But almost as if she gave us some signal that she was now more available, a boy named Dean Stanley, who was a swimming counselor to little kids at the Y, where Marissa had a volunteer job stuffing envelopes, hung around her all the time, finally asking her to go out with him. "Why would I want to do that?" "Because you're nice," he said hesitantly. Dean, a white, extremely white, 6'5" swimmer with greenish gold hair from pool water, was forthright in a way that was similar to Ralph. He seemed to enjoy being a young male and all it entailed, and why wouldn't he? Marissa would probably have enjoyed it too. When he kissed her with a muscly tongue at the multiplex, she let him. And when it progressed from there at the studio apartment he'd borrowed from an older lifeguard, she didn't try to stop it even though she didn't feel much of anything again. Beyond the experience that this was hers alone, this was something she could master. She knew that most people did not approach sex the way she did. Even Eva Scarpin, who had supposedly been to bed with her father's business partner, a handbag importer of 27, said it was amazing. Though Marissa knew instinctively not to ask Eva the kinds of questions Willa had asked her. Did you feel a lot? Was it wonderful? Because she was afraid she knew what the answers would be. Once, years earlier, Marissa Claiborne's toddler brother had to be rushed to the hospital after eating a dozen aspirins one by one. In the ambulance, their mother had said to him, "Conrad, didn't they taste bad?" And Conrad had said, yes, they had tasted horrible. "Then why did you keep eating them, sweetheart?" she'd asked. "Because," he explained as he cried, "I wanted to find one that tasted good." A rationale that his sister definitely understood. At age 16, neither of the 2 boys she'd been with so far had tasted good, so to speak. Truthfully, sex bothered her because it was not nearly as intense as it was reported. She liked being in charge of herself, being responsible, being poker-faced and precocious and skillful. She conducted herself this way in all other areas, so why not in sex too? But it didn't fill her with a warmth she'd never previously known. Marissa Claiborne was dexterous in sex. She didn't mind it, and most of all, it was hers. This was how she felt about acting in plays too. Dean Stanley disappeared after the summer, and he occasionally texted her, but they had 0 to say. So there she was, leaning against the counter one winter night at Froze, reading the Lysistrata script, her mouth moving silently as she committed lines to memory, when Jason Manousis walked in with his young son. Jason of the legendary Jason and Cammie high school pregnancy scandal of several years earlier. He'd gotten Cammie pregnant, they'd immediately left school. Cammie had had the baby, Jason had wigged out about fatherhood and enlisted in the army and gone to Afghanistan, where he was blinded in one eye and was sent back home looking like this. "You're Jason Manousis," she said when he approached. "You graduated from Elro with my sister." "I didn't graduate." "Well, I mean you were in her class. Tara Claiborne?" "Yeah, Tara," he said without recognition. "How's she doing?" Good, said Marissa. She's still out in Palo Alto. I'll tell her I saw you. He nodded, and they both knew that she would say to her sister, remember Jason who got that girl pregnant and then went off to Afghanistan? I saw him. God, it's extremely sad. There was no way around this outcome, and she already felt guilty as if she'd betrayed him in advance, though she'd never meant to do so. Daddy, I want ice cream, his son announced. If he really wants ice cream, Marissa said, I would take him somewhere else. He'll hate this. It was no surprise when, after he ordered a cup of original regular, the boy spit out the first mouthful with a vengeance, shocked. They add the tang chemically, Marissa explained to Jason. I'm not supposed to say this, but the taste is fake. You're supposed to think it's got these healthy live cultures, but it's got nothing. She insisted on giving him his money back, and then she sent them on their way, but not before hearing a little bit about his time in Afghanistan, where he'd taken shrapnel to his eye. The war was a disgusting waste of energy and time and life, he'd said. No one can ever win it, everyone knows that, but there we are, acting like we can. The war's intractable, he told her. Intractable, he repeated as though he'd just discovered the word. We had no choice at first, but now we do. It's going nowhere. It's a rotten mistake. He spoke in a soft rush, as though they knew each other intimately, or as though the connection with her sister gave them a reason to talk. Her sister Tara had barely known him. They'd been in the same grade, but Tara Claiborne had been an academically fast-tracked girl, and Jason Manousis had been a poor student with no interest in anything at the time but smoking weed and his girlfriend. When Jason got Cammie pregnant, the two of them had headed off into life together like two people holding hands and jumping feet first into a volcano. They soon became a cautionary tale about teenage sex. Jason and Cammie and their mistake of a baby with that mistake of a name, Trivet. Then Jason had gone to Afghanistan, and now here he was at the mall, no longer a joke, no longer just the duncy young father of a baby he couldn't name right. He was a veteran of war with a face that could not be loved unless you also loved the person inside it. And who would do that? Jason and Cammie were long broken up and now shared custody. Marissa ascertained that Jason Manousis was on disability and that he hoped to find a job in electronics. If you know anything, he said perfunctorily. His life, described by him without self-pity, seemed as unreal to Marissa as the life of a character in a play. It was as though he was speaking lines that weren't true, except there in front of her was the evidence of his partly ruined face, and she couldn't imagine how to make sense of it. She whose worst problem was not having spending money, for in addition to rehearsals 3 evenings a week, she had to go to her job and she had no free time. She whose parents were always anxious about money, warning their children they had to keep their grades up and take part in an inhumane number of extracurriculars in order to get college scholarships when the time came. There was no wiggle room in the Claiborne family, but with Jason Manousis' life set into relief against hers, she remembered that hers wasn't a tragedy. So began their friendship. She went to work at Froze, and at some point in the evening he wandered in. Marissa noticed that people looked at his face in frank and shocked manner, as if when confronted by such a sight, they forgot they were adults and reverted to some primitive child state in which you were allowed to stare and make comments to yourself or your friends. Jason and Triv returned to the store on Saturday night when the mall was as crowded as it would ever be. Not as crowded as it had been in the old days, but not a ghost town either. Kids from the high school roamed listlessly in packs. From behind the stainless steel counter, she saw Danny Fratangelo and Doug Zwern. Danny had once tried to copy from Marissa's history exam and had been angry when she wouldn't move her hand. Why didn't you let me, he'd complained after class, following her down the hall. I would have let you, he said, which was an absurd idea. She didn't remember ever having any reason to speak to him after that. Doug Zwern was known at school as a notorious dealer of J-juice, that liquid drug that made people hyper and gave an animated edge to everything they saw. Occasionally, people on J-juice lay back happily in bathtubs or pools and drowned. Sometimes they didn't sleep for days. Mostly they had a good time. The J-juice trade was lucrative lately. It was said that Doug Zwern was saving up to buy himself a car by the time he got his license. As Danny and Doug passed back and forth in front of Froze a few times, like a repeating loop of scenery out a car window in a low-budget movie, Marissa felt a current of wariness. Triv said, Dad, I don't want this. You don't have to eat it, his father said. We're just visiting with our friend Marissa. Jason smiled a little, which pulled at the skin under his bad eye. He was challenging her, seeing whether two people who didn't know each other at all could be friends. But why would they do that? What was the point? Marissa didn't know, and yet they stood there like friends, talking more about the war and about Kunar province, where he'd spent a lot of time, and the other vets he'd become friends with, a few who'd been killed, and about fatherhood. Then, as if the details of her life were remotely close in importance to his, he asked her about school and about being in the play. He said she should call him if she ever needed anything, and he asked her to enter his number into her own phone, which she did, feeling generous for it, for she was as likely to need his help as she was to need an academic boost from Danny Fratangelo. But while Marissa couldn't imagine needing anything from Jason, she appreciated how kind he was, so much kinder than Ralph Devereaux or Dean Stanley. Marissa had her script out, and Jason said, "Actually, you need help with that?" To be polite again, she said, "Yeah, I do. There's this one part where Lysistrata says an oath. You could help me with that. You could be the other woman, Kalonike. You don't have a guy's part for me? This is the section I need to learn." "Okay," he said, "I can deal." She handed him the script, closed her eyes, and back and forth they went. Her voice, as it always was when she had to read aloud, became full-throated and emphatic. "Lysistrata, come them Lampito, and all of you put your hands to the bowl, and do you, Kalonike, repeat in the name of all the solemn terms I am going to recite. Then you must all swear and pledge yourselves. I will have naught to do, whether with lover or husband." Kalonike, "I will have naught to do, whether with lover or husband." Lysistrata, "Albeit he come to me with strength and passion." Kalonike, "Albeit he come to me with strength and passion. Oh, Lysistrata, I cannot bear it." Danny Fratangelo and Doug Zwirn entered the store as they rehearsed. They watched them from the doorway, then came up to the counter and stood in elaborate scrutiny of the board and all its choices. Marissa put the script down abruptly and turned to them. "Hey," she said flatly. "Hey, Marissa Claiborne," said Doug Zwirn. "I didn't know you worked here." "Yeah, I do." "Do you get free ice cream?" "It's not ice cream." "No, it's not," said Jason. "Hey," said Doug Zwirn, "you're Jason Manousis." Jason nodded. "You serve. We're supposed to thank you, man, so thank you." Jason paused. "You're welcome." His son danced around him, saying, "Can Marissa come out into the mall?" Doug and Danny looked at father and son, and then, in curiosity, at Marissa. They couldn't understand this scene, why someone like her would be doing with the physically destroyed Jason Manousis. And they couldn't just leave it a mystery. They couldn't thank him for his service to their country and go. They finally looked at each other in confusion and irritation, and something built between them. The two boys twitched at each other, gearing up. Danny Fratangelo said to Doug Zwirn, "The school play is Greek. You ever learn Greek things, Doug, like mythology?" Doug just looked at him. "I don't know where you're going with this, Danny. Just answer me." "Yes." "Okay, good. Who's your favorite character from Greek mythology?" "What? How would I know?" "Pick one." "Oedipus." "He's not mythology. You know who mine is? Cyclops." "Just saying," Danny added. There was a pause, and then Doug said softly, "Cyclops, you douche," he said. But he still began to laugh, and Danny laughed too. Marissa couldn't stand to look at Jason. Instead, she kept looking hard at Doug and Danny, those loser clowns, those pricks, laughing and falling against each other. They left the store before anyone could say another word. Late that night, after her parents and her siblings were asleep, Marissa Claiborne sat on her canopy bed with her laptop open. She went online and searched Afghanistan and intractable, and the results tumbled in. Despite the counterinsurgency, Afghanistan was a failure, impossible. She was embarrassed she'd known so little about the war until now, that she lived in such a liberal, harmonious town, but had thought about the subject so lazily. She went on to Forest to see who was there, for it calmed her down whenever she was agitated, as she was now. She soon became her avatar, a hawk, flying around the top of the screen, where the green world gave way to who knew what. Below her was Willa Lang, pacing back and forth in a patch of forest, as the ninja she always was. "Are you okay?" she asked Willa, even though she knew this would only lead to a conversation about the breakup between Willa and her boyfriend Eli, which was all that Willa Lang could think about, or talk about, or write about. "I'm okay, but I know that we wouldn't last. I had to end it. But I feel so much for him. I'm sure you know what that's like, Marissa." For consistency's sake and out of pride, Marissa Claiborne could only say yes, she understood. Then she took off again above the trees into the green sky, and as she flew, she thought that soon she might have some kind of hookup with Jason Manousis. It was a thing to do, and he would be so grateful. They would go to his apartment where he lived alone out on the turnpike past peppercorns and past the DVD and Chinese specialty items store. Marissa knew Jason's building. It had a saggy outdoor wooden stairway like a motel. She pictured him standing with his keychain, squinting with his good eye and trying to find the key. She hated the idea of him out there struggling. It wouldn't matter that she wouldn't particularly like kissing him. It would be a serious act of kindness that would return him to his former self, restoring his eye, his appearance, his psyche. Now, flying around Forest, she spoke the line from the play, "I will have naught to do, whether with lover or husband." It seemed all at once like the most exquisite and tantalizing line imaginable, and suddenly, as she kept flying, she entered a dense, cold patch of air, as though the atmosphere at the very top of Forest had changed. Her bird self and her girl self were both freezing. Was it the temperature in the bedroom or in Forest? For a brief and slightly delirious moment, she could not tell the difference between the two worlds or her two selves. A cold wind slapped Marissa along her shoulders and arms and face, and also struck the chest feathers of her hawk's body. The spell grabbed her even as she flew, and she thought, "I don't want to have sex with him or anyone. I've never liked it enough. I've never felt about it the way I want to. It had all been a cheat, a ripoff, and maybe someday it would get better when she found the right person, as everyone said. But who wanted to stick around that long? Not touching Jason, not doing anything with him, she realized would be better. Like Willa, Marissa was suddenly done with that. Boys knew nothing. They wanted what they wanted. Kitchens closing, Ralph Devereaux had said to her nervily. The one she cared about, and it wasn't sexual, was Jason. He was deformed according to Danny Fratangelo and Doug Zorn. He was a monster. He wasn't entitled to get a hot girl to hang around with him. Jason had once been handsome, and Cammie Fennick had liked him and had sex with him, but the war had ruined him. It was all unspeakable now, the war, its mutilation and destruction, and she couldn't bear the sadness. It could break her down. Suddenly, on top of not wanting to sleep with anyone, she wanted to do something in protest. If she wasn't going to be thought of as coolly sexual anymore, then at least let her be asexual for a reason. Just as she'd become sexual overnight and now suddenly not, she too would be political. It was her prerogative. The drama teacher talked to the cast all the time about the ramifications of the play Lysistrata, trying to get the actors to think about them when preparing to go on stage. Marissa Claiborne logged out of Forest and quickly went from being a hawk to being a girl. Fully spellbound, she tried to figure out how to bring her new desire to have nothing